Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carla Freeman. I'm director of the Foreign Policy Institute here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and it's my distinct honor to open today's program, Women Who Inspire. The program was started a number of years ago. This is part of a series to celebrate women as shapers of policy, as leaders in international affairs, and indeed as makers of history. So it is a very exciting series, and I am so pleased to see so many students and distinguished guests in the audience. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce two women who inspire. Ambassador Shirin Tahir-Kelly, who will host this program today, and our featured speaker, Helene Cooper. Dr. Shirin Tahir-Kelly is a senior fellow at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, and she inspires me and working with her. She spent several years at SAIS before joining the Foreign Policy Institute a number of years ago. But her role here today follows many years of government service here in Washington, D.C., and also at the United Nations, which included a role working at the White House with Condoleezza Rice on women's empowerment issues. Her career itself is remarkable, and I know she is writing a soon-to-be published book on her career and her role growing up, her role here in the United States after a childhood spent in Pakistan. Our speaker today is the author of a new book that we all should read, and I have just bought it, so I haven't read it. Helene Cooper is a Pentagon correspondent with the New York Times. She joined the paper about a decade ago as assistant editorial page editor and then became diplomatic correspondent, followed by White House correspondent in 2009. She has many honors and has won many prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize for her work in Liberia during the Ebola epidemic. She's also the winner of the George Polk Award for Health Reporting and the Overseas Press Club Award in 2015. She's also the author of a best-selling book, The House at Sugar Beach, In Search of a Lost African Childhood, a memoir of her own childhood growing up in Monrovia, Liberia. And the book that I just mentioned, Madam President, The Extraordinary Story of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, which was published this year. I look forward to a rich and fascinating discussion between these two inspiring women. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Carolyn. I really appreciate that, and thanks to all of you here. What is my college roommate doing here? Sorry. Hi, Alison. Thanks a lot to to Valley and Dario, who promised me a year ago when I was still in the throes of writing that they would host something for my book. So I really appreciate this. And Ambassador, I'm looking forward to our discussion. For me, this book began 12 years ago while I was on a reporting trip in Eastern Congo. I didn't know it at the time. We never realize in the moment when something significant is happening. At least I don't. I had been on assignment for the New York Times in Eastern Congo as part of a series of stories that I was doing about poverty and development in Africa. I went to Ghana, I went to Ethiopia, I went to Kenya. And I remember with each place, I kept thinking that despite all of the challenges, nowhere I went seemed as bad off as my own home country of Liberia. Until I got to Bukavu, Congo. Oh, finally, now I'm home, I thought, as I crawled out of this small single-engine plane. After the semi-desert of Ethiopia and the savannas of Kenya, Bukavu was otherworldly lush, just like my home country of Liberia. Leafy green mountains, rich banana trees, the same luxuriant, verdant landscape that we have in Liberia. And the same sense of abandonment that came from having a population ravaged by years of pointless civil wars. Hundreds of boys trolled the streets with nowhere to go. Downtown buildings were marked with holes from rockets and grenades. The only cars were the white UN SUV vans. What struck me most, though, in Bukavu were the women. As I drove into the city, I passed women I had known all my life. There were old women with huge bundles of bamboo sticks on their backs. There were market women in their colorful dresses huddled at the side of the road selling oranges, eggs, nuts. There were young girls sitting in front of huts, bathing their little brothers and sisters in rubber buckets. No electricity was anywhere around, but one 10-year-old girl had dragged a bucket of dirty creek water up the hill so that she could wash her 4-year-old sister. These were the women that I had grown up with in Liberia, the women all across Africa, the worst place there is to be a woman, who somehow managed to carry that entire continent on their backs. I remember one woman in particular who stood out to me in Bukavu. It was twilight when I passed her, and she was trudging up the hill with all of these logs on her shoulders. Her husband was walking just in front of her. He carried nothing. Nothing on his back, nothing in his hands, nothing. He kept turning around and telling her to hurry up. That image has stayed with me for 12 years. A few months after my trip to Bukavu, I was back in the United States when the women of Liberia, my home country, staged an incredible power play. Defying centuries of history in the most patriarchal of places, they flooded to the polls and staged a democratic coup. They upended years of male rule and voted for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf to be president of Liberia, the first woman to be democratically elected president in an African country. I knew instantly that I wanted to write about this. This book looks at the what. It's a book about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and what it took to upend all those years of male rule in Liberia. But it's also a book about what drove the women who put her in power. And it's a book that looks at how they did it, how these women got so fed up with being exploited and raped and assaulted that they decided that the only way forward was to turn the tables on the men any way that they could. In 1985, a young Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was thrown into jail by Samuel Doe, then the president of Liberia. She was put in a cell next to men condemned to die. She listened in that cell as the men next door to her were executed by firing squad. Afterwards, Ellen sat in the corner of her fetid cell, her eyes squeezed shut, her lips moving silently as she prayed, wondering if the soldiers would rape her before they killed her. Hours passed. Outside, the soldiers drank and became even rowdier. Then, just past midnight, one soldier walked up to her cell, stood at the bars, and stared at her. Several minutes passed in silence. Then he said, "I'm going to fuck you." He opened the cell door and Ellen rose to her feet, heart pounding. But just as the soldier was entering her cell, a voice behind him said, "As you were." The soldier dropped his hands. "Retreat," said the voice. The soldier closed the cell door, locked it, and moved away. Her savior stepped forward into the light. He was slightly older than the others, in his mid-20s, with beautiful dark skin and a serious face. Looking at him, Ellen wanted to cry. "They say you Gula?" He asked her. "Ma pa Gula," she replied. "Say something in Gula." "Ise." "Where pa town?" "Joshua," she said. Her rescuer stared at her for what felt like forever. Finally, he said, "Okay, I will steal you tonight. Nobody will humbug you." So on that night, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was not raped, but someone else was. A young Gio girl who had been captured and brought to the Shefflin barracks was gang raped by soldiers there in the early hours of the morning as Ellen huddled in her cell. Whether Ellen's would-be rapist took part as well, she would never know. After brutalizing the girl, the soldiers brought her, naked and crying hysterically, into Ellen's cell and pushed her in. She looked to be around 19 or 20. She was bleeding, and her eyes were wild with fear. Jumping up, Ellen put her arms around her and lowered her onto the floor. In the corner, the two rocked back and forth, clutching each other. Slowly, the girl's cries softened. Her naked body started to tremble. Leaving her new cellmate for a moment, Ellen went to the bars There were few soldiers milling around alongside the one who had rescued her. "Hey, man, y'all think about your mom then," she said, her voice shaking. The soldiers looked at her. Ellen tried again. "Think about your sisters." Still nothing. "I beg y'all, at least please bring lapa or something for the child to wear." Finally, one of the men left and brought back a piece of cloth, and Ellen helped the girl cover herself. For the rest of the night, the two huddled side by side. They did not sleep, just sat and rocked back and forth as the minutes ticked away until dawn, when the soldiers came for Ellen. As she walked to the Jeep, Ellen looked at the young Geo cellmate. The two women had spent less than 12 hours together. One was now going to face the man she was certain would be her executioner. The other was staying with the men who were certain to rape her again. The Jeep pulled away, and Ellen turned in her seat to stare at the young girl. She would never see the young woman again. But in many ways, that young Geo girl would change the course of history in West Africa. The Geo girl will become a stick of fuel for the fire of the women's movement in Liberia. Little girls don't come out of the womb vowing to become activists for female power. They don't spend their childhood thinking about how they will repair the indignities, large and small, that bleed women daily. It's a series of things that multiply and turn ordinary women into movements of female determination. You're living your life sweeping floors at Renenbaum Drugstore in Madison, Wisconsin, when your husband storms in to yell at you in front of your white boss lady. You're stunned by the violent shock of a hand slapping your face, delivered by the man who promised to love, honor, and cherish you till death do you part. You feel the warm, wet skin of a brutalized, naked, hysterical young woman as she crouches in the corner, bleeding after being savaged by the men who swore an oath to protect Liberia and her people. "I wanted to be a school teacher like my mother," Ellen said, looking back 30 years later. Describing that night at the Shefflin Barracks, she would use the mental sleight of hand that is common among survivors of unimaginable horror. She would relay the events of that night with no emotion whatsoever. The joyride on the beach, which the soldiers told her would be her execution site, the useless pleas from the condemned men that she find a way for them to be spared, the overwhelming terror of men who know they're about to die, the overwhelming terror of knowledge that you are about to be raped, the gut-clutching anger of holding a young woman after she has been raped by soldier after soldier after soldier after soldier. "That's what I wanted to do when I was young," Ellen said, "to teach." The young Ellen, the Peking who would not be Ezio, may have started off wanting to teach, but this was not a woman who was destined for the granular. Hers would be a different destiny, one launched in a Jeep by the young Geo girl who had been her cellmate. President Doe didn't realize it, but in locking Ellen Johnson Sirleaf up in jail, he created both an international cause célèbre and ignited the women's movement in Liberia. All across Liberia, young women were riveted by the story of this jailed female political dissident who was standing up to the men running the country. Eventually, after a year and under pressure from women's groups and the international community, Doe released Ellen, but he had created a monster. The stage was now set for the revolution that would overturn gender politics in West Africa. But the men still had one more act to play, and it was a doozy. I could stand up here for hours and go on about what Charles Taylor did to Liberia, but that should be the subject of its own book. The tribal war he started, the child soldiers, the hundreds of thousands of people killed, the wars he launched in Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast. He kidnapped children from their terrified mothers. His forces went on a raping and killing spree that spared almost no one. Once again, as they had so many times before, it was the Liberian women that carried the country through. While the men were waging war, the women in Liberia all became market women, traveling by foot to the border to get food to bring back to a starving population. They had the babies of their rapists in the forests, strapped those babies on their backs, and went back into their market stalls, or sat on the side of the road selling oranges. And they bided their time. When the war finally ended, they made their power play. In 2005, 12 years before Pantsuit Nation became a secret Facebook group, and I'm with her buttons and bumper stickers sprouted on lapels and SUVs here in America, the women of Liberia held a master class on how to get a female elected president. They had the perfect vehicle for their guerrilla campaign, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, a woman who was supremely qualified, who by far outqualified the men who were running, but who also had zero qualms about playing dirty politics and fighting any dirt the men would fling with smellier dirt. The election came down to a choice between the 67-year-old Harvard-educated global bureaucrat and the professional football player, George Weah. George Weah was a world-renowned football player, a star in Europe when he was a striker for the Italian team AC Milan. In 1995, Weah won the Ballon d'Or and was named the FIFA World Player of the Year and the African Player of the Century. 2 goals in particular stood out. One was against Bayern in 1994 when he embarrassed not 1 or 2, but 3 Bayern defenders with his quick pivots before letting rip a gorgeous sally into the near post. The other goal, known around the world even today as the goal, was in 1996 when Weah destroyed the Verona midfield as he single-handedly slalomed his way down the pitch, twisting, turning, bucking, and weaving all the way to the Verona goal in a legendary performance that Liberians, who watched it using their makeshift Tiger batteries because there was no electricity, still talked about a decade later. That Weah had no college education didn't bother his youthful supporters, who countered that the Verona goal showed his own education. At the other end of the spectrum was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, finance minister under former President Talbot, dissident against former President Doe, United Nations, World Bank, IMF pedigree, ally turned foe of Taylor. She had morphed from an abused wife, cowering and hunched in the front seat of her husband's car while he slapped her, to an international bureaucrat, an iconic political dissident who was attempting to do something no woman had ever done before: win, by popular vote, the right to lead an African country. The men fell in line behind George Weah and then complained that the women supporting Ellen was sexist. It was a remarkable display. Given the choice between a football player with no credible college education, but 2 fantastic goals against Bayern and Verona, and a Harvard-educated development expert, the top male presidential candidates who felt short in the runoff, with one exception, endorsed the football player. Weah, meanwhile, honing his message for why he, and not the old lady, should run Liberia, settled on an educated people failed theme. You know book, you not know book, I will vote for you, became the Weah runoff slogan. And that theme was endorsed by the failed male presidential candidates. Liberia had one of the lowest literacy rates in the world, so an illiterate population would identify with the president who dropped out of school, right? Wrong. What the men who endorsed that strategy failed to realize is how much the very idea was pissing off the market women. Those women may not have been educated themselves, but they worked day and night in the fields and the market stalls to send their children to school. Now the men were telling them that education wasn't important. Just as the men fell in behind Weah, the women fell in behind Ellen. It didn't happen all at once. Female political candidates had appeared all over the ballot in the first round of the elections, running for Senate and House on the same ticket as Weah and other male candidates. But once the time came for campaigning for the runoff, those allegiances peeled away as even the women who were staunch members of parties that opposed Ellen's Unity Party abandoned the men and took up the new mantra, vote for woman. Door to door, the market women passed out T-shirts and handed out flyers. They slept on the side of the road at night, curled up on their mats. They walked from village to village, exhorting women to vote for woman. Weah's supporters responded by predicting that if he lost, the country would go back to war. No Weah, no peace, they chanted. So the runoff started resembling past elections, like the one in 1985, in which Doe's supporters had suggested the same thing: vote for Doe, or the country goes back to war. In Liberia, this tactic was how men managed to get their way. They simply threatened the people. Except that in November 2005, they appeared to have met their match, because the women had their own tricks that would make Weah's threats look like boys' play. You want beer? Just give me your voter ID card. I will give you beer. I say we buying voter ID cards, or 10 Liberty dollars for one. Who looking for money? Just bring your voter ID card. The group of women had stationed themselves at a bar near the ELWA Junction, a major intersection in Monrovia along the road to Roberts Field. Except this time, it wasn't sex on the table. And this time, the women were the ones with the cash, and the young men were the ones with the commodity for sale. Some of those boys were finished stupid, one market woman recalled with a smirk. She was happy to go into detail about what she called the women's crafty techniques. We were crafty, oh, she said, one silver tooth glinting in the sunshine as she laughed. Many of the young men thought that they were done with voting after the first round and didn't understand that they would need their ID cards again if their man was actually to assume the presidency. Others knew and didn't care. Late in the evening of a muggy hot day, the lure of a crispy cold and multi-club beer far outshone whatever benefits they thought their voter cards would bring them. As for the ones who were too smart to sell their voter cards, well, their mom simply stole them. Some of those Oma and them, when their children had hard hair, says they're still voting for George Weah. They stole their children and voting cards, Parley Harris said, looking sheepish and defiant at the same time. One market woman, who agreed to be referred to as the Oma, said she snuck into her son's room while he was sleeping, slipped his voter ID card out of his wallet, and buried it in the yard. Years later, there was no shame among the women who stole their sons' ID cards. Yeah, I took it, and so what? The woman said. That foolish boy, what he knew? I carried him for 9 months. I took care of him. I fed him when he was hungry. Then he would take people's country and give it away. You would get elephant head to a child to carry. After burying their sons' voter ID cards, the women supporting Ellen had then dug up an old video of a naked George Weah. Somehow, a 14-year-old commercial for cologne that Weah made while he was in Italy just happened to surface in the Liberian media. In the commercial, Weah, at the time a world-famous striker with the Italian football team AC Milan, walks into the restaurant to greet his white dinner date after dousing himself in cologne. He's fully clothed at the beginning, but when the woman sees him from across the room, she's so overcome that she imagines him naked. The commercial then cuts to a naked Weah strolling across the restaurant to his date, while other white women in the restaurant drool and fan themselves. Finally, Weah arrives at the table, leans over it towards his date, and smiles. When he sits down, he's clothed again, and he says suavely, "Tutto bene?" To get an idea of how this commercial played in Liberian politics, you have to understand this country's Bible-spouting Puritanism and its deep racial scars. Many of the freed American slaves who founded Liberia were the mixed-race children of white slave owners who proceeded to set up the same kind of society from which they had fled, except this time the lighter-skinned colonists were the upper class, lording it over the native Liberians. So matters of race still struck deep into the heart of the average Liberian. That's why, for many Liberians, it was bad enough that Weah was strutting around naked on Italian TV, but in front of white women, that was too much. "Weah walks butt naked," screamed the headline in the New Democrat newspaper, which provided this hilarious synopsis of the commercial for those without access to YouTube. The video scene portrays white women in looks of sexual awe and ecstasy, glancing at the black man with his athletic build and muscular features, exposing his genitals, flipping, walking before them. Weah's political supporters tried to brazen their way out. "Mr. Weah committed no crime by posing butt naked," one party official helpfully told reporters. "Only constitutional deviants should not be elected," whatever that meant. But the body politic quickly dusted off their holier-than-thou cloaks. Adopting the convoluted sentence structure at which Liberian men were particularly adept, Joshua Duncan Freedom, a principal of the King Pentecostal High School, told reporters, "If the Congress for Democratic Change, through its vocal spokesperson Acarius Gray, can justify George Weah's butt-naked video on the International Information Superhighway on some constitutional right, then Liberians must be prepared, God forbid, under a CDC rule, to give audience to the legality and normalness of murder and even cannibalism." The truth is, this cloak of religious indignation simply covered up what Liberians of both sexes were really mad about. That Weah was flashing his oiled, well-chiseled body, buttocks included, in front of white women. Liberian women saw it as a rejection of black women. Liberian men were jealous. Either way, this was a loser issue for Weah, as Ellen supporters knew it would be. On Tuesday, November 8th, the people of Liberia woke up and went to the polls for the second time in 4 weeks. There was a real and palpable sense in the air that something big was happening. Helpful poll workers at a polling station in Sincor were allowing pregnant women, nursing mothers, to cut to the front of the line. So Bernice Freeman, Louise Yasse, and a handful of other women were passing around babies and toddlers. "You won't borrow the baby?" Bernice was grinning at one woman, sneaking a furtive look over her shoulder. "Put the baby on your back." To another woman, she advised, "Act pregnant. If they think you're pregnant, you can vote in front." It was unclear whether the poll workers noticed how many different women were carrying the same baby. The Oma was in the lead, though. That night, a bunch of women were listening to the election news when an informant came in with an update. The official results weren't in yet. Some polls were still open. The final tally wouldn't be known for weeks. But already there was a whisper in the air from Ellen's spies posted at different polling places. People weren't supposed to disclose voting trends at the polling booths for fear of swaying those who hadn't cast their vote yet. But all across the country, Ellen's army of women were finding ways to skirt the regulation. For Lucy Sloan, the workaround came by reverting to an old nursery school chant used to teach children the alphabet. S-O-So, G-O-Go, N-O-No. Every Liberian kid knows this chant. For Lusu on runoff night, the chant took on a new meaning. Hanging outside a polling booth, she nervously asked an informant how the vote was going. He eyed the voting officials in attendance, then grinned slyly. S-O-So, G-O-Go, N-O-No, he sang. Then he added, UP up, Unity Party up. Lusu started dancing and singing in glee. S-O-So, G-O-Go, N-O-No, UP up, UP up. When the election officials glared at her, she sassed them. You can't stop me from singing my S-O-So, she said. UP up. She went to bed that night singing. The old lady was in the lead. On Wednesday morning, Ellen woke up and walked into her living room to find it already full of campaign aides, excited about the preliminary returns from Lofa and Nimba counties. She wasn't just in the lead. She was in the lead by a lot, 60% to 40%. It was a lead that she never relinquished during the days of counting that followed. The old lady would be Madam President. Out of the 25 years of carnage that was Liberia's descent into hell, had emerged a new leader, and that person was a 67-year-old grandma. On November 23rd, after the officials' results were announced, Ellen was heading back to her house from campaign headquarters, juggling congratulatory phone calls from all over the world. In the backseat of her SUV, her American friend Steve Cashin turned to her grinning. The White House just called. President Bush wants to talk to you, he said, then recited a very secure, encrypted phone number. Call this number. A minute later, Ellen was on the phone with the American president, accepting his congratulations. Then the phone went dead. Liberia in 2005 had no landlines thanks to the war, so everybody used cell phones. They paid for their service from Lone Star Cell Company by purchasing scratch cards from grown-up boys on the side of the road. The president-elect of Liberia had just run out of credit on her scratch card. Turning to Cashin, Ellen smirked. This isn't very presidential, is it? When word spread about Ellen's victory, the markets of Monrovia emptied as the women who minded the stalls at Rally Time and Nancy Doe and Red Light and Painesville ran jubilant into the streets. Go to school, some of them yelled. Don't play football. I still think about that woman I saw in Bukavu in the Congo all those years ago, the one walking with her husband carrying all those logs on her back. In so many ways, this book, I think, is for her. Thank you.
Oh, please. How much time do we have?
50 minutes. So
50? Take a seat.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Helene, if I might call you that, we just met,
Please.
but I think I would like to add my welcome to that, the Dean and Carla, in having you come and speak to SAIS as a woman who inspires. You indeed do. Your storytelling alone is amazing. I was telling you that I got the book on Kindle, which is not always the most fun, but I was traveling and I was never at one place long enough to order it and pick it up. So having read it and then having you talk about it, it sort of is a double adventure for me, and I thank you for writing it and for your great storytelling capacity. I think you've sort of set the stage so well for how this extraordinary leader became the first woman president, something that hasn't happened in too many nations yet. And so I want to sort of take the conversation after where you ended in your sort of story, to ask you the question that I remember when my son was 3 or 4, and every night I would read to him, and then when the book finished, and I'd close the book, and he'd say, "And then what happened?" Which I remembered in my government career, because around the table I'd say to people, "Hey guys, you know, it's not over yet. And then what happens?" So she becomes president. I was touched, horrified as a woman, connected with the story of what she went through to get there. Some of her struggles I followed on the US government side, because I was first at the White House and then at the State Department during these years. And she created enormous excitement in terms of the possibilities that she would bring, not just the symbolism of the first woman president in Africa, but what she in particular, that particular president would bring. So if you could sort of take a few minutes or however minutes to just talk about how you saw it unfolding. She becomes president, and she has all these amazing number of extremely talented and clever market women behind her. She has stood down the men with arguments as well as just the sheer power of her personality, I think. But now she's in charge.
It's a lot harder to govern a country than it is, I think, to run for office. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is now at the end of her 2 terms in office. She was reelected in 2011. Liberia is undeniably in far better shape now than it was in 2006 when she became president. But it hasn't been a smooth road by any stretch of the imagination. Corruption, which is endemic in Liberia, is still very much present in the Liberian government. Every interaction, I think, that many Liberians have with their government seems to be transactional. So she hasn't done enough on cracking down on corruption. She's fired corrupt officials from her government, but she hasn't really prosecuted them. So that's been an ongoing battle, and I think that's something that we're going to see stretching into the future. I was just in Liberia to cover the presidential elections for who's going to replace her, and there's a lot of disappointment that's quite palpable about her 12 years, and that's in part because Liberia is still a very poor country. And there were so many high expectations when she became president that I don't think any leader could fulfill, but she certainly disappointed a lot of people. On the other hand, Liberia has been free of war for 12 years. We've had 12 years of peace. We've had electricity come back and running water coming back to the city and spreading now throughout the country. The country went more than 20 years without electricity or running water, which it's hard to even fathom. There's been an enormous progress in the way women are treated and in the prosecution of simple things like rape. She has got, in what is an almost supernatural feat, was able to get Liberia's $4.7 billion in debt forgiven, and she used her international contacts. And that, to get that done, and no other leader would have been able to accomplish something like that. And that seems like a very technical thing, but when she became president, the country couldn't borrow, was a dirt poor country that could not borrow money from anybody. So you couldn't even begin to start to rebuild. And she was able, through like force of sheer will and manipulating the international community, to get that debt forgiven, which is a huge, huge deal. So I think it's a mixed deal if you look at her overall tenure, but if you look at it long term, a mixed deal in Liberia compared to the guys who came before her is a huge, huge step up, because the guys who came before her all drove the country into 25 years of brutal civil war. So if you're comparing it to that, she looks like, very much deserving of her Nobel Peace Prize. If you compare 2017 now, say, to 2011, there's been a feeling that, the big strides that she made the first term from 2006 to 2011 slowed down between 2011 and 2017. One more thing I would mention, though, is that, and this I looked at, every time I go back to Liberia, I remember growing up in Liberia where when anybody, and Liberians are very vocal, and if you criticize the government, you got thrown into jail. Now you turn on the radio in Liberia and everybody's complaining about the government, how horrible it is. There's this freedom of speech that's taken root in Liberia that we haven't had before, and you don't see political dissidents being thrown into jail. And I think that could actually end up being the lasting impact of her legacy, is that it's hard for me to imagine that whoever comes after her, Liberians are going to be willing to tolerate losing the freedom of speech that they have now.
Do you think that the absence of war, which is no small achievement given what's going on around the world, just to be, will that continue beyond her tenure, or is she somehow a presence that, along with her being very sharply tuned into various things, and the international community has been able to manage things better? In other words, once she's no longer in office, has this culture of no longer at war going to survive?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's what everybody is worried about. Our football player, who we talked about, is now in the lead to be president in this elections. He's in a runoff now. They're going to announce it on Wednesday that he's the top vote getter. But he didn't get to 50%, so it's going to be George Weah versus Joseph Boakai, the vice president. They're going to go against each other in November in the next runoff. And this time Weah could win. I don't know, I have no predictive powers over the Liberian elections, but he has a shot at it this time.
The world has changed.
A lot has changed.
The TV ad might help him.
But his vice president, his running mate, is Charles Taylor's ex-wife. And so you already have a lot of worry in Liberia that, you could see a return to not the Taylor regime, but, you have a lot of those same characters who are now supporting him. The vice president Boakai is no little innocent shrinking flower either. So there's a lot of concern. I was last week, it was the day before election day. Was that just last week? Maybe it was 2 weeks ago. I was in Liberia and the women staged this big rally the day before election day, and they had this giant sign up there that said, "Don't touch our peace." And that's their message, is look, we've had 12 years of peace, don't mess with it. But their
vote that's
vote
still a force, the market women?
They are, but they're much more diluted now because there's not one singular politician who they rallied behind. And so, they voted for all different politicians, and that's but they definitely said that if, they feel that if things go back to the way they were in the past, they will start up again with some of what they took to get her elected president to begin with.
I had sort of a wonderful interaction. I was telling you when we, in the Dean's conference room, that I got to meet President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf because she was one of the, actually, 18 founding members of Condi Rice's Women Leaders Working Group. And there were several issues that were being looked at, but we talked a lot about the women and justice issue, which she really addressed the fact that women become victims of rape in zones of conflict. And civilized behavior requires some way of putting that under international scrutiny. So we worked on what became UN Resolution 1820, making rape, the use of rape as a weapon of war, a crime against humanity. And I went to India to work with the Indians on developing a cadre of women peacekeepers. And the first deployment was in Liberia. So at the next meeting, President Johnson Sirleaf said, a couple of things had happened once the peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers came as in their blue saris, and they were stationed very prominently in Monrovia. She said the statistics on rape were being more easily reported by women, but at the same time they found a drop in the incidence of rape. So she wanted this to become a sort of a permanent part of how the UN does its peacekeeping. And this was very much something that she kind of spearheaded along with Condi Rice. It was a very interesting, slightly sort of exposure that I got to have. To go back to your book, you referred to it in your address as well. The level of violence, which is of course typical of any civil war type situation as we see in so many countries now currently. Is this something that has declined in the culture given the changes she made, given that the peacemaking has become, there are women involved, etc., or it was extremely, extremely brutal, which
it was certainly the violence, particularly violence against women. 70% of women in Liberia have been raped, which is a staggering number if you think about it. It's impossible to walk around and not run into women who have these stories to tell, and a lot of them don't want to talk about it, which is which is very unfortunate. And I think I would criticize her there for not doing actually more on the whole issue of talking about rape and domestic abuse in particular, because she herself was a victim of domestic abuse. Her husband beat her. And she talked to me about it, but I had to pull that out of her. She did not want to talk about it. And we went around and around and around during the years that I was working on the book. And
you mentioned that.
She kept saying, I don't want to hurt my sons. This is their father. And these sons are like in their 50s and 60s. This is their father, he wasn't all bad. And I kept thinking that you are the president of this country governing over a place where the vast majority of women have been brutalized. You can talk about this and take this from underneath the table and take this from an issue that's to be ashamed of, which is how so many women who were raped, who were gang raped by soldiers in Liberia, so many of them feel that it's their fault. And you can stand as an example to try to pull, to get rid of that whole idea that it's the woman's fault, but she didn't want to do it. And I think what it says is also just how personal rape is and how personal domestic abuse is, that even a woman as accomplished as Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was all of these things that she managed to do, and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, still feels secretly ashamed that her husband beat her. And that says a lot about the culture of what you're dealing with in Liberia, and it says just a lot about, this is not something that's going to be solved, in one presidential term or in one fell. This is something that's endemic and that's deeply rooted in so much of how these women view themselves and how they view their own interactions with men.
Is it more typical of Liberia as opposed to Sierra Leone or the Democratic Republic of the Congo?
Look at Congo. Are you kidding? The UN peacekeepers in Congo were raping women.
Yeah,
They were the ones who were sent to protect the population, and look at what they did.
That's what led to that.
I think this is a weapon of war all over the world. I don't think this is endemic to Africa at all.
And it's becoming even more widespread, unfortunately. Well, it's such an interesting book about an extraordinary woman, but I know that there are people in the audience, and SAIS audiences tend to be involved audiences, which is why it's always fun to get speakers here. So let me stop and open it up to Well, let me start at that. And please wait for the microphone. And if you would take a second to identify yourself,
Sure.
that'd be great.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Kent Davis Packard, and I coordinate a new program here at SAIS, a new initiative that focuses on the contributions of women to international peace and security called SAIS Women Lead. And my question is about the upcoming elections and women, and I wondered if her presidency has inspired any other women candidates in the presidential elections and for the municipal elections as well. Thank you.
The elections were held 2 weeks ago. There was, out of 20 presidential candidates, there was one woman who ran, and Magdala Cooper, who is no relation, but she is a former model who is best known in Liberia as George Weah's baby mama. It's like Liberia is like, it's such a great place to be a reporter because there's like, you can't even imagine. So this was a love affair that went poorly, and 1 minute she was giving interviews to the New York Post about how she was going to be the next Liberian First Lady. They split up, and so she ran against him for president. She did not get into the runoff. She was like but she didn't do too badly. She was like number 7 or 8 out of 20. But the rest of the candidates were all men, a number of warlords, former warlords. We had Prince Johnson came in third. He's the guy who had his forces slice off the former president Samuel Doe's ears and cut off his penis while he drank a beer and videotaped the whole thing. He came in third. There were other warlords, George Dwyer, who his claim to fame is, he was a warlord, but he also named all of his children after himself. So there's George, Georgie C, Georgie Jr., Georgetta, it's like 10 kids. So there are a lot of characters running for president in Liberia, but now we're down to 2, George Weah and Joseph Boakai, the vice president. And the runoff is going to be on November 7th. They'll announce that on Wednesday, I think. So when you look at Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, she certainly served, I think, as a beacon for young girls. You go into any elementary school now I go into in Liberia, I get young girls coming up to me telling me they're going to be president, and they feel that they can. But there's no immediate Ellen Johnson Sirleaf right now. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf candidate.
Has she endorsed anyone, or?
She is not, but now that's getting into a whole nother can of worms because she's feuding with her vice president. The two of them are mad at each other, so she hasn't endorsed him yet. She hasn't not endorsed him, but she hasn't endorsed him.
Okay, I guess I'm learning.
And there's a rumor now that she could possibly endorse the football player, which would be, I think, would be a
Pretty
huge.
ironic.
I think if she does that, she will have done a lot of damage to her own reputation.
Yeah, well, and when's the cutoff for this endorsement?
Well, the
Everybody
election
wants-
is November 7th. She's been quiet so far.
So it's-
And the fact that she hasn't been out campaigning for her vice president has people thinking, but the two of them, I'm not going to bore you guys with why the two of them are fighting, but they
we're
are.
interested. You've got us engaged. I see. So, but there's no hope of a resolution in her endorsement prior to the
No, she
election.
could come out and endorse somebody. She may not endorse anybody, or she could come out and endorse the vice president. She's under a lot of pressure right now to do so, or she may stun all of us and endorse the football player, which I think would probably be a big mistake. But I would not, at this point, there's a long. I don't want to get into all the internal politics right now of Liberia, but some of the vice president's supporters have targeted her, and. And she is prosecuting, is leading the prosecution of the head of the Unity Party, Varney Sherman, for corruption and trying to get the Supreme Court to take up the case. And he has gone and made a lot of threats against her. He's videotaped threatening her and saying that, they're going to come after her. So there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. But that said, I still think that if because of that she ends up not, endorsing the football player, she will be viewed internationally as putting her own personal well-being ahead of that of the country. Although I think George Weah could I think, the betting right now is he's going to win anyway. So you could make the argument that she's positioning herself so she can influence him once he becomes president, but I think that's a stretch.
Is there a role for her in Liberia post stepping down from presidency?
We don't know. We've never had a post-president. Our presidents get killed.
Okay, so that already is precedent setting.
Yes, she wants, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf wants to remain vibrant in the Liberian political scene. She's 78 years old. She says she's going to live at commute between her farm in Jojua and Monrovia, where her house is. And she's probably going to travel and give speeches. This is not a woman who's going to go quietly into the good night. She's going to be out there.
Has that road been paved? You talk about all the potholes going on that road.
No. Every road that gets paved, our rainy seasons are vicious. So it's not a matter of just paving a road one time. It's a matter of something you have to go back and do again and again and again. I was in Liberia, and then this gets into a different topic, and then we should go to another question because we're still on yours. But I grew up in Liberia, and rainy season was from June to August, and we had a lot of rain then. Now rainy season in Liberia starts in April and it goes through November. I was just there in October for 2 weeks, and you hear this pounding rain, you can't understand where that water is going to go, and it destroys the roads. It just, so it's a constant.
A question on this side? Yes. Please wait for the microphones coming. 1 second, please. Microphone's coming.
You mentioned the historic fabric of the Liberian population with the actual African population and then the descendants of the freed slaves. And, the name suggests Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is that she's a descendant of that population group. Is that still an issue in Liberian politics, or doesn't it matter anymore?
Thank you for the question. I will try not to be as long in my answer as I was in the first one. She is not a descendant of freed slaves. She is she's a descendant of a German trader who came, and her grandfather was German, and he married her grandmother and then abandoned her during right before World War II, when all these Germans were expelled from the country. And he left and didn't take his wife and child with her, World War I, sorry, didn't take his wife and child with him. And then on the other side, on her father's side, he's a Gola man. From Jojua, which is in Bon County, right outside of Monrovia. However, you're right, there has been a lot of tension between the descendants of the freed slaves in Liberia and the rest of the population. They made up like 3 to 5% of the population but they controlled the vast majority of the country's wealth, and that's what led to the civil war that we saw going on in the late 80s and in the 90s that finally ended in 2003. There's still trickles of that there. It's not as bad as it was the divide isn't as bad as it was when I was growing up, but there's a little bit of it still there.
Yes, ma'am. Microphone's coming.
Thank you. My name is Chiedo Wanwan with the African Studies Program. So I don't think there's any doubt that she has been successful, at least to the extent that she has established peace, and there's an extent or a level of democratic stability. However, I think there's this, among the feminist studies group, there's this feeling that she shrank back once she became president, right, from advancing the women's gender equality agenda. For example, there's a doubt to what extent she helped create institutions, right, that would continue to advance gender equality once she leaves office. For example, she did not support the legislation for increased women's political participation. I think, people also accuse her of legitimizing female genital mutilation in the country. So while she's certainly no shrinking flower, to what extent has she, advanced the women's agenda in the country? Thank you.
Thank you. People accuse her of a lot of things that aren't true, and one of those is the advancing female genital mutilation. blaming Ellen Johnson Sirleaf for that would be the same as blaming, Hillary Clinton for the presence of rape in the United States. I was with her actually in Georgia when she took on these, and we have a very westernized view of female genital mutilation here in the United States. And one of the things that a lot of people here don't understand is that a lot of this is done by women. These are women who are running the poor society in the Greater Bush. And I was with her actually and personally saw her taking on some of these women up near her farm, up in where she called them in, because they take these girls outside, out of school, and they take them out there to become women, and they teach them and that's where a lot of this female circumcision is practiced. And she had been on and on and on about she was trying to target it as you can't take them out of school, let's start that way. But you have a lot of traditional societies in Liberia that push back against what they see as a Western notion of the West is not going to come and tell us how we're going to turn our girls into women. And so it's not a simple matter of, oh, I'm just going to outlaw this. It's very much a matter of trying to deal with what some people in the West think as a backward society, but you're taking on both the men and the women when you do that. And she has gone after that because I've seen it myself. That said, I think you raise a lot of very good points. I don't think she's done as much towards promoting a female successor, for instance, or promoting more participation of women in the political scene in Liberia. But I think we ask for a lot from our leaders. You've got to look at how all of the things that she had on her plate when she became president. You have a country that was completely post-war. You had no electricity, no running water. Nobody would loan money to Liberia. The place was an apocalyptic wreck of a place. Being able to advance there's no leader on earth who would have been able to come into the situation that she came into and been able to do every single thing that you set out to do. It's much the same as you see a lot of the left here in the United States who complain that Barack Obama didn't do enough to advance Black people's rights and to advance the state of the whole Black Lives Matter movement started under Barack Obama. And you see the kind of narrow space that he had to address those issues. So I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot more that she could have done, but I think we also have to be realistic about what these leaders can accomplish in the time that they have.
And are women, in any case, judged, fighting to get 4.7 billion, forgiven took a little time also in addition, but I think that one expects, because we haven't had enough women leaders, so we really pin a lot more hope, I think, on them, and I'm more disappointed when they don't deliver across the board.
Yes, I think that's true. But I think we should pin more hope on them, and I think she should be held up to...
because they're capable enough. Yes, please wait for the microphone. And please identify yourself.
Thank you very much for coming. I read your book, I guess about 4 or 5 months ago. It's very good. Did have a question, though. I mean, it might seem a bit unusual, but you say in your book that, well, in reference to Charles Taylor, it's a Charles Taylor question, about the Civil War and this war with Samuel Doe. You say that Taylor had this practice of wearing wedding gowns and wigs and fright masks he thought would help him in battle with Doe.
No, I didn't say that. I said his forces.
I'm sorry?
His forces.
His forces.
Yes, not Taylor himself.
He didn't wear it himself, his forces.
Not Taylor himself. I wrote Taylor's forces.
Okay. So why? I mean, what was that? I mean, I served in the military myself, right? Mm-hmm. I never heard of men wearing wedding gowns and masks and wigs, thinking that that's an advantage in military warfare, It's
all part of Liberian culture and society, and those guys that did it felt that this was part of their juju, that it would help to protect them in battle. There was also a general butt-naked of the butt naked brigade, and they would grease themselves up, they'd strip themselves naked, and they ran around with their guns completely naked because they believed that the oil that they put on would protect them from. So it's all part of, it's all part of the lovely stew pot that makes Liberia such a rich place to cover as a reporter.
Question here, please, on this side. I keep saying, of course, please identify yourself, but maybe that's not relevant.
Hi, I'm Lisa Jenkins. I'm a SAIS student, second year. I also want to be an international correspondent, so I have kind of a more general question about your career. Has sort of navigating the gender politics of the various countries that you've reported in had an impact on your work, and has that kind of changed over the course of your career, specifically as a female journalist?
That's a great question. I cover the Pentagon now, and it's definitely different doing that than it was when, because you're surrounded by guys all the time. I'm often the only woman if I'm embedded with the military. Sometimes there are women there, but often I'm the only woman around, and I think that probably affects how I go about. I often feel isolated when I'm on stories, but every woman will tell you that we're women. We know how to deal with men. We've learned how to live in our own skin, and you just adapt. So it's hard for me to stand from the outside and look at myself and say, has such and such affected the way I cover anything? I sort of try to adapt myself to whatever situation I feel like I'm in. I've had bosses in the past. Most of my bosses have been men, but I've had female bosses in the past who I think some of them have been great, and I think some of them have given more deference to the men, and I found myself getting angry at them, and that's been the case with male bosses as well. So I don't think at this stage gender should in any way affect what you try to do as a reporter. If you're used to being a woman, this is the only skin you're ever going to live in. So the way you go about, adapting it to the life that you live is something that you'll employ as a reporter as well.
Yes.
Hi, Ms. Cooper. I'm Jessica Grounds. I co-founded a group called Mind the Gap, and we work on gender strategy across sectors in business and politics. I think you met my business partner. Been working in the space for 20 years. Your book is phenomenal, and it is absolutely a master's class in women's political leadership, and I think everybody who cares about this subject needs to read your book, because you do it in such a...
Thank you. Can you come around with me?
Yes, I'll be happy to be your spokeswoman. It's fantastic. I couldn't put it down. My question is actually what you kind of referenced a little bit earlier around working with interviewing, and you talk about this at the end of the book, of course, with the president, her actually interviewing and talking with her and having her open up. One thing I think you do so beautifully is you talk about what she's done so well to rise to the top, but also you didn't paint her in a perfect light. And I think that's a really admirable thing. How did she take that when she read the book? I'm curious to hear kind of a little bit more about that process and how she kind of took it in. Thank you.
Our president, thank you, that's a very good question. Our president of the United States notwithstanding, you don't become a successful president without knowing how to take criticism. You have to be able to do it. She takes a lot of criticism. You go to Liberia, and I was talking about that freedom of speech thing. You turn on the radio, and you're gonna hear this, you're gonna hear political arguments. You're gonna hear people saying this, that, and the other. And so I think she knows how she can take it. Her reaction when she kept asking, when are you going to show? And it's like, let me explain something to you. I don't show you the manuscript. You don't get a whatever on this. So when she finally got the actual book, there was silence for about a month. And then I heard from her, and she said overall she thought it was fine, but she didn't like, I spent too much time on the domestic abuse, she said, when it's like 4 pages. It's not even like a whole chapter. She wanted me to, there was some stuff in there about her boys that she didn't like, because she's very protective of them, even though they're all in their 50s and 60s. And she, as a young mother, she had had all 4 boys by the time she was 21 or 22. And then she left them as children, as toddlers in Liberia, came to the United States and went to college. And that guilt over leaving her sons, even though she went back, but she was very much an absentee mother. That guilt has still stayed with her for her entire life. And so a lot, I think so she ends up having a blind spot when it comes to her sons. And she's come under rightful accusations of nepotism because they're in high positions in the government. And she doesn't seem to, whereas her political antenna, which seems very sharp, when it comes to a lot of other stuff, if you look at her boys, it's like not, it seems to not be there. And so she wasn't crazy about some of the depictions of them in there. She was still being very protective. But overall, she's, you know, like any leader who's been out there in the public sphere, she knows how to, she can take a hit. And so.
But you covered her international experience and her work. She surely was okay with that part of it.
She never mentioned it, so I assume no. I mean, it's like.
But you know, if you weren't able to get her to talk about the abuse aspect of her personal life, is it just common knowledge and that's how you met?
No, she talked about it. She just didn't want to talk about it. And she didn't want me to write about it. I mean, I would ask her about it and she would give me, yeah, he hit me. And I'm like, well, tell me about when he hit you. And she was like, yeah, you know, men, and it's like, I kept going back over the course of 4 years. Tell me, and then it's even at the end, I mean, I've been working on this book for 4 years and I can't give you the number of hours I've sat talking to her. And it was on one of our last interviews in the middle of the Ebola epidemic when I was in Liberia talking to her then, that she told me, you know, some of the most personal parts of the abuse stories. And as a writer, I've never been a big thinker. Even as a reporter at the New York Times, the rap on me is that I'm too granular. I write anecdotally. I use stories to tell a story. I'm not one of those people. This is why I could never be a columnist. I'm not one of those people who can come and give you these great macro think pieces because I don't think that much. But I can use a story to tell a story. And to tell her story, I wanted stories. I wanted to know what happened in that moment. Tell me about when he hit you with the back of the gun and you were in the bathtub. Tell me about what happened in the car, in the front seat of the car when he beat you, I want to know what time was it, what was it, blah, blah, blah. And this is where we ran up against issues. And I eventually got it from her, but it wasn't easy. And in a way, you're making somebody go back to relive really painful parts of their life, and a lot of people don't want to do that. So yes.
Hello, my name is Stephen Schneebaum, and I'm on the adjunct faculty here, but in real life, I'm a lawyer, and I represent the government of Liberia here in Washington.
Oh.
And have known Madam President since the 1980s, and I'm an enormous admirer of her, and therefore an enormous admirer of your book.
Thank you.
But I want to pursue one thought that a few other questioners have raised concerning legacy. When Ellen Johnson Sirleaf ran for office in 2005, and the mantra was vote for woman, she had 2 things going for her. The fact that she was a woman was one of them. The fact that she was eminently more qualified than the other guy was another one. And the same thing was true when she ran for re-election in 2011. This year, we have, let's say politely, we've had a list of 20 fairly undistinguished candidates for the presidency. The 2 who've survived to the runoff round include the very same George Weah that you were talking about, and talking about somewhat dismissively, and I agree with you. But if the mantra vote for woman is to be heard in 2017, then votes go to Weah because he has a female running mate. Female running mate happens to be, as you said, Charles Taylor's former wife, which is no promotion, but she's a woman. The issue of qualification, the issue of her accomplishments and her achievements, the Nobel Prize, and just being the capstone on all of that, appears not to have resonated with the people of Liberia as well as it should have. Why not? What's gone wrong in the process of leaving a political legacy?
That's such an interesting question. And I don't know that I have a pat answer for you to that. First of all, I think I would disagree with you a little bit, because I think the vote for woman definitely, that mantra in 2005 definitely was a big part of it, was her gender, but people did not vote for her. Those market women weren't saying vote for woman only because she was a woman. They were saying vote for woman because the men had just, in their view, run the country into the ground, and she was the antithesis in their mind of the people, the men who had come after her, and because she was extraordinarily more qualified than any of the men who came. If you looked for an Ellen Johnson Sirleaf clone, and there was maybe one of them in the presidential elections, Alex Cummings, who's this former Coca-Cola executive, who she probably secretly wanted to see win. But she didn't endorse him because her vice president, who was on the same party of her, was running against him. And he did a lot better than anybody thought he would do. George Weah selecting Howard Taylor as his running mate. Nobody in Liberia looks at Jewel Howard Taylor as somebody who represents women in Liberia. She's just viewed as Charles Taylor's ex-wife. So George Weah would not be running on the vote for woman type ticket. I don't think the women, the market women, or the women who are still caring are looking at it that way. But it's definitely an interesting legacy, you know, and I think she's going to have this legacy issue. I think when we step back and look at it 50 years from now, you have people, I was just in Liberia, as I mentioned, already saying, you know, and these are the people who've been huge critics of her for definitely like the last 6 years, and maybe some of them for 12 years, saying, you know, sheepishly, yeah, you know, if it were actually up to us, we'd be fine looking at these guys who are running, maybe we do want another 6 years of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf before, because be careful of what you wish for. So there's certainly that, and there is definitely a fear that underlying a lot of people in Liberia about where the country is going now, if you look at the people who are now poised to win. But I think the whole legacy issue is going to be an interesting one, but I suspect, I may be wrong, but I suspect that 50 years from now, when we look back at her legacy, we're going to look at it a lot different than we do right in this instant.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Rachel Ostro. I'm a SAIS alum. I currently work at the Open Government Partnership. In your book, I noticed you talk a lot about the market women who support their families by buying and selling in the markets. Liberia is exceptionally wealthy in natural resources, but the beneficiaries are largely foreign companies or a couple high-level businessmen, almost exclusively male. Do you think women's economic mobility has expanded since Sirleaf became president? And what do you think the future is for women and economic empowerment in Liberia?
First of all is, say anything you want about the bulk of the wealth from the country's minerals and stuff coming from, you know, foreign companies. The market women run that country. The market women, there's no economy in Liberia without the market women. They are the driving force behind the real economy. I'm not talking about, you know, when people sit and do their economic indicators. I'm talking about the street economy. That is completely run by the market women. Without those women, this country would have been so much worse off during the war. They were the only thing that passed for a functional economy during the war years, and that was because they were going to the borders, and they were the ones and they still run that economy. They still, the real underground economy of Liberia is run by these women. There have been, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has started a Market Women's Fund. They're like, there's a lot of things that have been done to help the market women in the last 12 years. I think the biggest thing, though, is that these women now know that they have political weight. They have now learned, because of what happened in 2005, that they can turn their economic power into political power. And this goes back to what you were asking, watching whether they're able to continue that growth, I think it's going to be really interesting to see.
But if they are basically the only ones, and they have established themselves almost as an institution in that role, even the new incoming crowd would need, I mean, unless you want to bring the economy. Yes, but the question, the bigger issue now is that only works if they're united. Right now, they are looking, they have not united behind one
candidate. Therefore, this is like their power is diluted.
Ah, okay. You've had, any other questions from, first-time questions? Yes, ma'am. Please wait 1 second. It's coming.
Thank you. Thanks. Deborah Harding, retired.
Hi, Debbie.
Hi, how are you? Helene, I wanted to just see if you agree with this on the gender issue. As I recall, Madam President passed an anti-rape law in her first term, and now that's under contention with the legislature.
Yes.
So that was, I think, a positive move, although there were plenty of problems.
And now the
in
men are
getting it.
trying to roll it back.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that is something that she really was committed to. Excuse me, set up the Ministry of Gender.
She didn't set up the Ministry of Gender. It was in.
Okay, well, it was there, but she had a
okay.
number of women in her cabinet, including, of course, the Minister of Gender.
And Foreign Affairs. for a while.
She, in her early, in the first term, she made it possible for kids to go to school without paying school fees, so it opened the schools to girls, and the girls' enrollment went up a very, very high percentage. Now, a lot of them dropped out, and other things happened, and Ebola came in and so forth. But, I mean, I think in the first term, she really did do a number of things that are meritorious about girls and women.
I would not disagree with you. I think she did. I think the rape law was a big deal, and what's interesting is now the legislature, which is still pretty male-dominated, is trying to roll that back, and so that rape is no longer, they want to make rape a bailable offense. The Senate has voted for that, now it's gone to the House. That's something that a lot of women are very worried, nervous about what happens after she goes, because if she was president, she would veto that if it got to her desk, and we don't know what the other people are going to do when that comes up to them. But I think you're right. I think there's plenty that she did accomplish when you look at how women in Liberia are treated. And I think there's a lot more that she could have done.
One last question from, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Tracy Reeves, and I direct media relations for Johns Hopkins University, and I also worked with Helene years ago, but not too many years ago.
I don't think friends should be allowed to ask questions. So you and Allison can go like over in the corner.
Well, I didn't know she was a friend. So.
We were former journalists together. I'm a former journalist, but I wanted to ask perhaps a closing question. I have not read your latest book yet. I will. I'm trying to get it signed first. But I did read Sugar Beach, and I've read your writings, and I've wondered when I see your writings about Liberia, if you have any desire to one day go back home and hold office.
President.
Oh my God, no. Are you mad?
I think that's a perfect ending question.
That's a great ending question. Absolutely hellified no. I don't mind going home, but you will never see me anywhere in politics.
Never say never, they say. Well, I think that was a simple answer.
But thank you, Tracy, for
Thank you so much to the audience, to our speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is fun.